Welcome to episode 113 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on March 11th, 2024. I fell down a rabbit hole and I had some technical issues while I was traveling, so this episode took several months longer than I thought it would to put together. C'est la vie, my friends. We're here now. We're going to be talking about Steek, the thing, the technique, but mostly the word itself. It was quite a deep dive. I also have a save the date announcement at the very end for the event coming up in Hartford. Let's get started. So yes, in a moment, I'm going to talk about the word Steek, but before that, I'd like to take a moment and address something that I have increasingly less patience for, and that is online rudeness. Now, we are allowed to disagree with each other. We're allowed to have different views on things. You can even press matters with me that we disagree about. But one thing I do not have patience for anymore are people who disagree with me and come in hot about it, because there's no reason for that. And we have lived with the widespread availability of the internet for nearly 30 years now. We all are well aware that there are people on the other side of the screen from us. There's no longer any excuse for rudeness in the online space. If you do disagree with me or feel like maybe I need to issue a correction, it's okay to let me know. If you come in hot with name calling and accusations, though, I will honestly first assume you're just having a bad day and reply. But if you come back hotter, I'm going to restrict or ban you and just end the conversation, because life is too short to validate that sort of behavior. In the first week of my master's program, they started to immediately prepare us for our eventual final thesis project, and we talked a great deal about academic tone. Even after extensive reading, long-term experiments, and analyzing the data that you've collected, you still need to leave room in your language and thought process for the possibility that you do not have a full understanding of the topic, or that someone researched the same topic and came to a different conclusion, or that there might be other work out there that completely conflicts with the conclusion you came up with. Rather than making definitive statements, you say things like, the data suggests, or it's my understanding that, or so-and-so found X to be true, but the data from these surveys suggests Y. I think we could all do better to remember to keep a level of humility in our conversations about things we disagree about. With that said, I'd like to talk about this word that we use in English as knitters, Steek. Where did it come from? How has the meaning evolved? What proof do we have of its use, and when and where? I am no linguist, but I do have an amateur's interest in linguistics, and an online incident sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole about this word. And also, I know a linguist, and I know a lot of interesting knitters who I could talk to. And as I spoke with them about the word, just the word, not even the technique, I realized there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. So I thought it would be interesting to share this deep dive into the word Steek with you. Grab your knitting and your warming beverage of choice, and we will begin. Quite a few years ago, I read the book The Professor and the Madman, A Tale of Murder, Insanity, and the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary by Simon Winchester. I'm sure many of you have read it too. It was a very popular book when it came out in the early 2000s, and there was a movie made about it. And it's fine. The movie's fine. I think the book is the better experience. It talks about the history of the compiling of the Oxford English Dictionary, or the OED, and it was fascinating for that reason, but also because of the lives of the people involved, which you learned a great deal about in the book. The amount of sheer work involved to compile the dictionary was astounding. So the OED is a catalog of every word currently or formerly in use in the English language, with all of their varying definitions, along with the earliest example the compilers were able to find of the word being used in print for each definition of that word. Of course, this wasn't something that one person or even a small team of people could do. They enlisted the help of English speakers around the world to help with the process. They were tasked with reading different books and manuscripts and creating these slips of paper with the word, where they found it used, and when that example was published, and the sentence it was found in. Sometimes people were contacted directly and were asked to seek out certain words in their libraries and create slips of their usages. Then they had to send all of those slips to the team of compilers, who then had to organize them all to be printed. The resulting dictionary was absolutely massive. It covers 1,000 years of English and currently includes over 600,000 words and 3 million quotations. It took 70 years to produce the original version. And of course, because English continues to evolve, it's constantly being updated. The initial printing took up an entire bookshelf and was prohibitively expensive as a result. Most of your average libraries did not have a copy, but the OED has been digitized, and now most people can access it either through their library's system subscription or as a student through the school's library. So my deep dive into the word steek started by turning to the Oxford English Dictionary to see if I could come to a better understanding of the word steek and how it's been used historically, and how it's developed over time generally, and how it eventually found its modern space in the crafting world. So looking at the entry in the OED for the word steek, there are currently 9 definitions. There are 4 nouns, 4 verbs, and 1 adjectival use of the word. 4 of the uses of steek live outside of the craft space, including its earliest recorded usage from 1175, when it was used in a text most likely written in northern England to mean to close something up, as in to enclose something, like you would steek up someone in a room. Within 50 years, steek appeared in print again to mean just to close something generally, like steek the door or steek the cabinet. And by 1393, the word already had a contronym usage. So a contronym is a word that has multiple definitions that oppose or contradict one another. So a common example is the word cleave, which can mean to bind together or to break apart. The meaning of steek had developed a contronomial usage to mean either to shut something out or to exclude something. So steek at this point you could use to mean to close something in, to close something, or to close something out. Additionally, by 1300, steek appeared in print with a totally different meaning: to kill something by stabbing it. So you steeked your enemy with a sword, or you steeked the deer with a spear. And by 1433, the word steek was a Scottish language alternative to the English word stick, which meant a cask of wine. And by 1812, when colliers or keelmen went on strike, instead of calling it a strike, they called it a steek. All of these uses of the word steek developed on mainland Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in Northern England. And one of those definitions is going to be pertinent for us, but the rest of those definitions don't relate to crafting at all. But I wanted to cover them for 2 reasons. First, as we talk about the craft definitions of steek, it's helpful to see how some of the usages of the word to this point built off one another, and some of them didn't. Also, all of these definitions came from the same general areas of the world: Scotland, Ireland, and Northern England. Language is fun. And before we get to the craft-related definitions of steek, I wanted you to have a good understanding of how weird and twisting and surprising language can be, especially before we had widespread access to printed materials and had begun to standardize our spelling. English does not have an academy that gatekeeps changes to its language. It's a mishmash of other languages, and it evolves with the creativity and inventiveness of each of its speakers and writers, and we are constantly adding to it. The OED grows by 2,000 to 5,000 definitions each year as new definitions are found and new words are created. So with all of that as a preamble, let's talk about the craft definitions of the word steek. That's its own winding and interesting road. So the meaning of the word steek that first appeared in print in 1300, meaning to stab something to death, had, by 1503, developed into another application, meaning to sew or to stitch or to embroider. And I think the connection's fairly obvious. You're stabbing someone with a sword evolved into you're stabbing something with your sewing needle. This usage appears in many print sources in mainland Scotland and Northumberland. By the following year, there were also instances of the word steek as an adjective, speaking about a steeked doublet, for instance. So something that had been sewn or that had been embroidered or had been steeked could be described as a steeked whatever. From there, it took over 200 years for another craft-related use of the word steek to appear in writing. This development, again, not shockingly, was the shift of steek from referring to the act of sewing or something that had been sewn to referring to a stitch itself. First, there's only evidence in writing that it was referring to a sewing stitch. And then after nearly 100 years, in 1797, a book about the history of Glasgow refers to steeks as knitting stitches, saying, quote, "The workman takes up 60 steeks in the time the knitter with wires could take up 20, unquote. So now we have arrived at knitting. In 1797, in Glasgow, we have a written record of the word steek referring to a stitch in the context of knitting. And this is a curious case, too, because one has to wonder, was Mr. Brown's History of Glasgow written by someone who understood knitting and knew that knitters referred to their stitches as steeks? Or was he the first to call knitting stitches steeks? Knitting would have been ubiquitous in most households by then, but the well-to-do often embroidered at that point in history. It was a much more refined pastime than knitting, and it may be that Mr. Brown coined the term steek for a knitting stitch by misapplying a term he knew from sewing. Or not. I'm inclined to think probably not. But we don't know. The use of the word steek for a knitting stitch may well have been widespread by that point. All we know is the first instance in writing yet found to refer to steeks in the context of knitting was in 1797 in Glasgow to refer to the stitches themselves. Again, the languages of the British Isles are slippery, whether we're talking about English or Scots or Shetland. UK languages are influenced by outside sources, by each other, and by the human tendency to be creative and metaphorical. Words rarely appear one day with a definition in place. They evolve with humanity's need for expression. Steek, in the Fair Isle knitting sense, meaning a collection of stitches that you will eventually cut, appears first in print in 1981. And this is where the discussion really starts to get interesting, because that seemed extremely late to me. But let's look at this first printed instance of steek as extra stitches you will cut. The first print evidence in the OED is from a book many of us likely have on our shelf called The Complete Book of Traditional Fair Isle Knitting by Sheila McGregor. My copy's just called Traditional Fair Isle Knitting. If you have a copy, you can pull it out and turn to page 31 and read along. You'll see it easily enough because steek is even in bold on that page. The first instance of the word steek in print from 1981 reads, "Traditionally, there were no reductions around the armhole, the gusset stitches being left on a stitch holder, and the sleeve opening bridged by a steek of 6 to 8 stitches cast on for that purpose above the gusset." So, in 1981, we have steek in print to mean a bridge of stitches added so the knitter can keep working in the round and eventually come back to cut those stitches. Now, that is likely far later than when it started to be used that way in Shetland. I reached out to a few of the long-term knitters of Shetland to ask them about it, and Hazel Tyndall, who grew up calling that bridge of stitches extra loops, has a collection of her mother's knitting papers, and in the margin of one of those papers from the 1960s, written by someone with different handwriting than her mother's, the word Steek is noted. And speaking with Elizabeth Johnston, her first memory of the word Steek being used to refer to that vertical bridge of stitches goes back to the late 1960s. But it is a term she would have learned from her mother, so was likely being used by some people locally earlier than that. But it also matters where you live in Shetland. Even now, some of the local knitters refer to it as extra loops rather than as a steek. Okay, put a pin in all of that. We're in the 1960s, and we have handwritten evidence of the term and local memory of the term, but the first printed use of the word is by a woman from outside of Shetland who first put the term in her book about Fair Isle knitting in 1981, because the knitters of Shetland were not yet writing about their own knitting. It was taught orally and visually, and all of the early books about the knitting techniques that developed in Shetland were written by knitters from away who came to Shetland and conveyed what they learned from the local knitters. Okay, hold all of that for a moment, because now we're going to go back to what started all of this, which is that in response to a meme that I posted on my social media account, in which I was trying to encourage people to be brave with their crafting, I said, "Steek a sweater." And someone came in hot. Not only did he insist that steek did not mean to cut a sweater, he said it was a Shetland dialect term used in Shetland lace knitting that had been appropriated, and that I was a terrible person for being part of this appropriation. That is the incident that sent me down the rabbit hole of wanting to understand more about Steek, because his accusation stung. Even though I also thought it was unfounded to be singling me out as a colonizer or whatever. And at this point, I did know that the word steek was used in Shetland lace knitting. I've sat with the knitters in Unst several times now, and I've heard them talk about how they use steek to refer to the vertical row of open work stitches that they make as they construct their lace shawls and scarves to separate the lace edgings from the lace panels at the center of the work. So I was stung by this accusation. And remembering that Shetland lace does use this word, so I thought, wait, am I perpetuating the use of an appropriated term? Which meaning came first? And where did the word come from in the first place? And that's when I turned to my friend who is a linguist, who reminded me that language is constantly being borrowed and evolving and redefined. And I reached out to the local Shetland knitters for their thoughts, and I turned to the OED. And in turning to the OED, I saw everything that I've shared with you so far. And I saw that the knitting usage of the word to mean a bridge of stitches continued to evolve outside of Shetland. The OED has another definition of the word, meaning to add stitches to the pattern you are knitting to create the bridge of stitches itself. So if I have a sweater pattern that I want to make into a cardigan, I can say I'm going to steek this sweater, meaning I'm going to add a bridge of stitches to it, so that later I can cut that bridge and it will become a cardigan. That usage first appeared in print in 1985 in another book many of you probably own called Knitting in the Old Way by Priscilla Gibson Roberts. But the more common verbal use of the word steek outside of Shetland that I think most of us think of first appeared in print in 2004. And I use that term loosely because it actually appeared first on a Usenet group on the internet. In 2004, on the rec.crafts.textiles.yarn Usenet group, in a thread called RE Steeking Today, someone posted the following. I went away for 3 days while my project to be steeked sat resting. I did it when I got back and all went well. So there it is, 2004, the first quote-unquote published use of the word steek, meaning the act of cutting that extra bridge of stitches. We have a very clear path for this word, from stabbing something to sewing to a sewing stitch to a knit stitch to a bridge of knit stitches that will be cut to adding that bridge of knit stitches to be cut to cutting that bridge of stitches. And along the way, we have traveled from mainland Scotland and the north of England to Shetland to the wider English-speaking world. And that is the complete path through the knitting-related definitions found in the OED, which is meant to be the complete record of English words and usages for the past 1,000 years. And you will notice, as I did, that there is no definition in the OED that refers to its use in the context of Shetland lace knitting. That doesn't mean it's an invalid use of the word or that it's not being used to mean that in English. All it means is that it hasn't been collected into the OED yet, and that possibly that's because it simply hasn't appeared in print. And so, off I went on a whole other fork of inquiry. And I'll tell you about that in a moment, but right now, I need a break. I hope this journey has been as interesting for you so far as it has been for me. If not, it's just going to get worse. You might want to call it a day. But if you're ready to stick it out with me, I'll be back in a few. And in the meantime, enjoy this. This is Giving Up by Humans Win.
Say you're giving up on me. Honey, I find it hard to believe. Struggling to stay or leave. Say you're giving up on me. Say it straight, say what you mean. Said you'd be here 3:30 at the bus stop all alone. Couldn't even pick up your phone. But that winter, spring, summer, fall, I was with them all, in the joy and in the pain. Honey, I will always stay. But you say you're giving up on me. Honey, I find it hard to believe. Struggling to stay or leave. Yeah, you say you're giving up on me. It's been years and then some more. Make up your mind, going back and forth. Take the car and grab your things. Just say you're giving up on me. But that winter, spring, summer, fall, I was with them all, in the joy and in the pain. Honey, I will always stay. But you say you're giving up on me.
Okay, we're back in this. The stage is set. I've shared how the OED collects definitions. They have to appear in some form of print to be included. They are still accepting submissions for new words and meanings as they are found. A person that I'm going to assume was having a bad day came in hot one day online and sent me on a guilt-fueled deep dive through the OED. Thanks to the help of some friends in Shetland, I felt pretty confident that I wasn't an evil appropriator because they had been using Steek in the Fair Isle sense of a bridge of vertical stitches that will be cut for decades. But along the way, I found that there is a missing definition for the word Steek in the OED that should be there. Steek is a word used in Shetland lace knitting. It is the name of a lace pattern used in Shetland and increasingly in other areas of the world to refer to that straight line of holes used mostly to separate sections of an item in a lace project. So, to get that definition submitted to the OED, I needed to see if I could find the Shetland lace use of the word Steek in writing and identify the earliest written use of the word used in that sense. That all said, and knowing what you now know about the path of the meaning of the word Steek in the Fair Isle knitting sense, and knowing what you know about how Shetland knitters taught one another orally and through demonstration and not through writing, I want you to just pause for a moment and make a guess in your mind about when you think I was able to find the first use of the word Steek in the lace sense in writing. Think that guess. Hold it in your mind, and I'm going to take you through my process in trying to track it down. First, naturally, I turned to my own bookshelf and started going through my books about lace. The first books I turned to were ones directly related to Shetland lace, and the very first book I pulled off my shelf was The Magic of Shetland Lace Knitting by Elizabeth Lovick. On page 52, she gives 2 sentences that make the meaning clear. Quote, "In Shetland, a steek is a line of holes." End quote. And, quote, "Steeks are often used to outline other patterns or separate sections of a bigger insertion or lace." End quote. That book was published in 2013. And I'm going to take you through the rest of my process, but I'll just spoil it for you right now and say that those 2 lines on page 52 of The Magic of Shetland Lace Knitting were the first instances I could find of the use of the word steek to mean a line of holes. Were you close? Only 11 years ago was the lace meaning of steek first used in print. And I'll give you my theory why that is in a bit. Stick with me because this was literally the first book on the hunt. My next thought was wondering if Carol Christensen's book about Shetland lace had come out yet. I pre-ordered the digital copy on Amazon, so I logged in, and sure enough, the digital version of the book was available for download. The hardcover is also out now, but at the time it was just the digital version. It's mainly a stitch dictionary that drew the stitch patterns from the holdings of the Shetland Museum and Archives, and the motifs in the book are stunning. Carol does include quite a bit of information about Shetland lace knitting and photos of some of the items from the collection, and she enlisted the help of many of the local lace knitters in the work who are acknowledged at the start of the book. I'll throw a link in the show notes if you're curious. I'm so impressed by this book. I highly recommend grabbing a copy. One thing that Carol addresses in her book is steeks, and in her information, she has the line, "It is the name for the simplest form of lace stitches, a yarn over, and 1 or more decreases repeated vertically." That's on page 16 of the book. It, of course, is referring to a steek, so I copied all of that down in my notes. There I was, 2 instances. Next, I turned to 2 small books that were published about Shetland lace knitting by the Knitters of Unst, and unfortunately, neither of them mentioned the word steek. From there, I went into my other lace books and had a poke around, and I just came up empty-handed. Then I started going through my old stitch dictionaries from the 70s that I've picked up while thrifting, and I found examples of steeks and instructions on how to knit them, but the books were calling them fagots or fagoting. And so, if we pause for a moment, those names appear as the name for a line of holes in lace knitting in books from the 1970s. I kept looking. I went to Google Books and did a search for the term, confining it to books published after 1830, which is about when lace is acknowledged to have really taken root in Shetland. I went to archive.org and did the same. I came up totally empty. I put all of this on the back burner until I got to Shetland in January, knowing that I could poke around in some more knitting books once I got there and had access to the archives, which I did about a month ago. I will say that all the books I had access to in the archives are ones that are commercially available. I just didn't own any of them. Still, I had hopes that one of their books about Shetland lace knitting would have an earlier reference to lace steeks than the reference in 2013. As I searched, I was also looking for more instances of steek in the Fair Isle sense of the word, just in case I saw one that was earlier than what the OED currently had. And instead, I found more uses after the initial uses. So Michael Pearson's traditional knitting used it to mean a bridge of stitches in 1985. And Alice Starmore's Book of Fair Isle Knitting used it in 1988. But again, those were after the first printed Fair Isle use. As far as the lace meaning went, there was a book of patterns from 1847 that had patterns that used steeks, but they weren't called anything. In Sarah Dawn's The Art of Shetland Lace from 1980, she refers to them as fagoting. The very first instance I found of the word steek in print in a book about Shetland lace was on page 226 of Sharon Miller's Heirloom Knitting, a Shetland Lace Knitter's Pattern and Workbook. In the book, she mentioned the steek diamond as an alternate name for another lace pattern, but because she didn't use steek in a sentence, I couldn't use that example with the dictionary people because it didn't make the meaning clear, even though the stitch pattern was diamonds outlined with lines of holes. So I will say the earliest instance I could find of the word steek in print in a lace sense is from 2002 when Sharon Miller's Heirloom Knitting book was published. That said, as I looked through the pages of her book, she does talk about steeks, but again, she uses the word fagoting. And after going through all of the books available to me on my own shelves, online, and in the archives, what I think happened is that people came from outside of Shetland, saw this aspect of Shetland knitting that used a line of holes to separate sections of the work from other sections and said, the rest of the world calls that line of open work holes fagoting. And when I write about it in my book, I'm going to ignore what it's called locally and just call it fagoting. And since the 1970s and 80s, those words fell very, 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 very out of favor as the English-speaking world stopped using it because of its meaning as a slur for a homosexual man. And after 2002, none of the other outsiders coming to Shetland and writing about Shetland lace were willing to overwrite the local use of the word anymore with their out-of-favor word. And so in Sharon Miller's subsequent books, she uses neither term. Gladys Almedro doesn't use either term in her 2008 book, and it's not until 2013 that we have an author who says that line of open work holes that you see in Shetland lace knitting is called a steek. I had an interesting conversation with Elizabeth Johnston about this. She makes the case, I think rightly, that the Shetland lace use of the term predates the Fair Isle use of the term, but that it just didn't appear in print until after the Fair Isle uses of the word. And as we talked more about it, she explained that in her mind, in her thinking of the meaning of the word steek, it means a vertical row of stitches. And that most likely, that meaning of a vertical row of stitches started in Shetland lace knitting because it predated the practice of cutting sweaters open in Shetland. And so when knitters started adding bridges of stitches to their Fair Isle sweaters to cut, they called it a steek because it was a vertical line of stitches being added. So a steek is a line of vertical open work stitches in a lace item, and it's also the vertical line of stitches that is added to a garment when you're knitting Fair Isle. She said also that to her, in relation to lace steeks, it doesn't matter if it's knitted by stacking yarn overs and decreases above one another to create the line of holes, or if the line of holes is created when you're joining parts of the garment together, as with the Betsy join, which is a sewn join that looks like a stack of holes when it's done. A straight stack of open work holes, however it's created, is a steek. All of this growth of the term and increasing uses happened within Shetland. We just don't see it happening in print because the Shetland knitters weren't publishing their own books and patterns about their knitting, and authors from away were picking and choosing which local terms to use in their writing. The Fair Isle meaning of the word was accepted by outsiders first, and the lace meaning was accepted only after the word the authors from outside of Shetland were using fell out of polite usage. Content that I had done my very best to understand how this word has traveled through space and time, and at least fairly confident that I found the earliest print uses of the Shetland lace meaning of the word steek, I sat down at the website for the Oxford English Dictionary and submitted the 2 example sentences from Elizabeth Lovick and Carol Christensen, along with a suggested definition. There is no space in the submission form to say who you are or to include an email address if they have more questions, or for them to email you to say they accepted your submission for inclusion. I am completely content with that fact, because how do you credit someone for a definition? I certainly did not make up the meaning. I didn't even come to an understanding of it on my own. A fellow who was probably just having a bad day sent me down a rabbit hole, and I noticed something missing from a book. The people who came up with this design feature lived long before me and created beautiful pieces of work. Very few of them ever had their names attached to the pieces they made that we stand in awe of now. We stand on anonymous shoulders, all of us. That said, I do want to thank the people who helped me along this twisting linguistic journey. First, I want to thank Elizabeth Johnston for her insight, and Hazel Tyndall and Elizabeth Williamson for answering my emails with their information. All 3 of these women are doing incredible work protecting what makes Shetland knitting Shetland knitting. I also want to thank Hazel Lawrenson in Unst, who was the first person I remember talking about a steek in the Shetland lace sense, and who is doing incredible work of her own preserving Shetland lace knitting and educating others about it. And thank you to all the other knitters of the Unst Heritage Center who meet with knitters and answer their questions about Shetland lace knitting while working on beautiful projects themselves. Thank you to Elizabeth Lovick for being the first one I was able to find who was willing to acknowledge that if you're going to talk about Shetland lace, you should use the words of Shetland lace knitters to describe it. And thank you to Carol Christensen for her new book that will hopefully spark a renewed interest in this heritage craft. And to the lace knitters that Carol acknowledges as helping in the creation of her book, Ann Yinson and Kathleen Anderson, Muriel Fox, Angie Knight, James Nielsen, Marlene Sim, and Jeanette Henry, as well as the others who helped her identify some of the names for the patterns. And thank you to my linguist friend Viveka Velupillai, who offered advice about where to look next and encouragement to prove the numpty on the internet wrong. This started out as one segment in a larger episode and grew into its own episode thanks to the help of all of the above and likely some more. I hope it serves to help us all better understand how language develops over time, how language can be overwritten or ignored by people who are writing about cultures, that it's okay to disagree, but maybe we can do it with some humility in case we're wrong, and that sometimes poking your head into a rabbit hole can lead you to unexpected places. I'll do another song, and then I'll come back with a few updates about other things. The show notes are going to be jam-packed this time, so be sure to check them out. Hop over and have a look now while the song plays. This is Humans Win again, with the very fittingly titled track, Before You Go.
I still remember the last time together we were a bottle of wine on a warm summer's night, down by the river with stories and whispers, ghosts
a few more things before I go. My degree program is well underway. I've just handed in my first major assignment, so I'm waiting with my stomach in knots to get the grade back for that. Thank you for all the kind messages and words of encouragement. I'm really fascinated by everything I'm learning, and it's opened my eyes to a lot of possibilities. I have a general idea of the workload now, and let's just say that it's taken over 2 months to get this episode out. So, yeah. I do have 2 half episodes written, and a 2-week spring break is coming up soon. So I may have more for you fairly soon, or I may not. Thank you for your patience. I'm just going to keep producing these as I can. I had a lovely lunch with Jolene of Island Vista recently, and I wanted to pass along that there are a few more spots available in the Shetland Lace Weeks of the Macking Our Way Through Shetland tours this year. There's a tour in May and in August. There's also a couple of spots in the Contemporary Crafts Week in August, which lines up with the Lace Week tour. So if you'd like to go to Shetland for 2 weeks, that would be a brilliant option. You'll learn from some of the most talented lace knitters of Shetland, but the classes are accessible to anyone who can knit, yarn over, and work a decrease. So don't stress. Come along and learn. To read more about these tours, visit islandvista.co.uk or use the link in the show notes. Many of you got really excited to hear about the potential event in Hartford, Connecticut coming up in August. Contracts have been signed, and so I feel comfortable announcing that August 17th, 2024, we will be having a Stitch and Pitch event at the Duncan Park in Hartford, Connecticut, with the Hartford Yard Goats playing against the Somerset Patriots from Massachusetts. This will be a family-friendly event, and you're welcome to bring your non-knitting, crocheting, or sewing friends with you. I will have a lot more details in the coming months, and I'm hoping to be set up to sell tickets by mid-April. I will be putting together goodie bags for 100 of the attendees, and you'll be able to buy tickets at a price with the goodie bag and without the goodie bag. So if you're coming with the whole family, you can opt to buy the less expensive non-goodie bag tickets for them if you want. If you are someone who has a fiber-related business and would like to sponsor something for the goodie bags, please send me an email at ann@ithoughtIknewhow.com. That's Ann with an E. I do have 4 sponsors lined up already, but I am looking for more. I'll share more about our sponsors in future episodes. For now, mark your calendars for August 17th, and I will look forward to seeing you at the ballpark. In the meantime, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. The show notes are where you will find links to the things mentioned in the show, so be sure to check those out. Find me on my social media accounts as I Thought I Knew How, except on X, where it's just Thought I Knew How. The groups on various platforms are all called I Thought I Knew How Podcast. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.